Ukrainian forces strike a roll call of Russian troops close to the front line, and supposedly even the Russians say at least 65 Russian soldiers pay for that with their life, while more details come alight or face the surface of the botched evacuation of Ukrainian troops out of Avdiivka. We'll talk about this and more events along the front line and in the rear areas of the war in Ukraine in this situation report. Before we switch to the events along the front line, we need to remember that yesterday was the 10th anniversary of Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, while most of us, when we talk about the war, we think about the time after February 24th, 2022, when Russia started its full-scale invasion. The actual hostilities began 10 years ago, or 10 years plus 1 day ago, when Russian special forces without national insignia started occupying the Crimean Peninsula. While the death toll in this event has been in the 1 digits, I think only 2 Ukrainian soldiers paid for it with their lives. After that, Russia, emboldened by the lack of response from both Ukraine as well as the West, started the fighting in eastern Ukraine, where Russian special forces and agents crossed the international border and started the fighting there. One of them, Igor Girkin, openly admitted in an interview that he, and I quote him, he was the guy who pushed the button to war, and that he's not some loudmouth claiming something, proved that he was then named the defense minister of the two so-called People's Republics for a couple of months, as he played such a pivotal role in the initial fighting. When the Ukrainian armed forces finally reorganized and started pushing those fighters back, the Russian armed forces intervened openly, including with artillery fire out of Russian territory, thus committing an open act of war against Ukraine's armed forces in 2014 already. So the war actually started 10 years ago already, and this was the anniversary. Now let's switch to the events along the front line. While fighting is continuing, I have nothing to report north of the Seversky Donetsk, so we switch right over. I have also nothing to report south of the Seversky Donetsk for quite a while. There have been fresh attacks towards Ivanivske, but I do not see any visual proofs that they have been successful. Any geolocalization that I found was within territory that was considered to be already, at least considered by me, to be already under Russian control. There were some claims that maybe the Russians advanced somewhat here at Vesele. That could be possible, but I'm not completely sure. I think in the last situation report, I also already saw the Russian positions at this point here. So let's switch directly down to Avdiivka, where we have more informations. The Russians have now reached Lastochkine. We have a geolocalization where the Russians attacked and suffered heavy losses. I think 9 armored vehicles that have been destroyed directly in the outskirts of Lastochkine. And while they have reached the town, they have not entered it to anything that I found, even though they are probably having a position here inside of the tree line already. The town itself, though, is still under Ukrainian control, which shows that the Ukrainians have created some kind of fallback positions here. I would not consider this to be the second line of defense, where we talked about in the last situation report about this here. It's far too close for that. The geographic, while it isn't bad with some water obstacles and some built-up areas, it's much more likely that the next more serious defensive line will go along the hills here and the water here. So this is likely a position that the Ukrainians took over to allow other forces from inside Avdiivka to retreat, and thus block and delay possible Russian attacks that follow their own troops and try to crush them, try to roll over them. This is probably a position like this. So while we should not see why we shouldn't expect the Ukrainians to give it up in time, this is probably not the point where they are going to push in significant reserves. Any day, though, that they buy there allows the fled forces that have left Avdiivka to reorganize, in parts to re-equip, allows for troop rotations, allows for additional time to build up the fortifications that are in the background, that any additional protection can be built in the time. So those soldiers here are doing a very important job, even though I would not expect this to suddenly Stepove, Lastochkine, Siverne to be the new planned defensive front line from the Ukrainian side. It should be a few kilometers further to the west. At least that's what I would expect looking on the map here. Further south, the Russians have advanced again in the direction of Pobieda. According to geolocalizations, Pobieda has likely fallen into Russian hands now. So we expect Pobieda now to be in Russian hands, meaning the front line is more or less along this point here. This clearly shows what the Russians are intending to do. They are trying to achieve a turning movement with Novomikhailivka. Now the retreat towards Konstantinivka is getting threatened from the north as well. So if they keep up the pressure, if they keep advancing in the southern area here, the Ukrainians soon will have no other choice but to retreat further to the west. This is obviously very important, as the Russians need to push them away from this railroad line. If they manage to achieve that, if they manage to get them not just out of mortar range, but out of regular troop artillery range, then they can start using that for resupply, which will then better the whole supply situation along the whole southern front line, which would be a strategic advantage for the Russians. So we should expect serious continued attacks in this direction. There's also been an attack reported close to Vuhledar. Again, the claims are that the Russians suffered heavy losses, but here again, we've seen much more activity than we've seen in the past few weeks. Again, a sign that the Russians basically try to even the front line here and re-establish a new front line further to the west to get this railroad line finally opened for their resupply runs. On the oblast border, we have some movement here at Shevchenko, close to the oblast border, even though the oblast border is here, so it's probably not quite close to it. But I apologize for this confusion here. Here we have a geolocalization, and you can see that they have advanced somewhat north here, and this is on this here. So that's not a big advance. It's 600 meters along the tree line here, but still they managed to push the Ukrainians somewhat back in this area. Further west, in the direct area south of Velika Novosilka, I cannot confirm any change in territory. And south of Orikhiv, we do have movements. First of all, the Russians have done bigger attacks over the last few days. We talked, I think it was the last or the previous situation report, that the Ukrainians said the Russians have concentrated probably 55,000 men in this area. Now we've seen attacks supported with heavy weaponry, and the interesting part was that the Russians used T-55s in their attacks. Now, while initially the T-55s we were told that they would be used more as a stationary artillery role, and that made sense, as they use 100 millimeter and nothing else except for some anti-tank guns would use 100 millimeter, and supposedly Iran has those high explosive shells in big supply. So it would have been an easy way to use up a new caliber, use up a new source of artillery. In this case, they were actually used as main battle tanks and suffered dearly. They not just suffered dearly because they are obsolete, they're old tanks. The problem was also that the anti-drone protection was limited, and they weren't even supplied with Contact 1 ERA, explosive reactive armor. The reason for that, we can only speculate. Maybe they were actually initially intended to just be mobile bunkers with a cannon on it, and were just pressed into service as they were available. This seems to be the most likely reason, regarding that they have first appeared like 3/4 of a year ago, or maybe a year ago, at a point where FPV drones have not been such a threat as they are today, where just to create a bunker with a gun, you probably wouldn't fill it up with Contact 1 at the same time. So anyways, we saw them using T-55s. They were taken out. The Russians have managed to enter Robotine though, but it's unclear if they are still in it. Now, obviously, we have some claims by the Russians, but there is visual evidence of them reaching the outermost houses of Robotine. Then we see Ukrainians striking them with artillery, and then there's a video of Ukrainians taking some of them prisoner. The fact that they took some prisoner shows us that a counterattack, a local counterattack, must have been successful. Otherwise, they wouldn't have reached that point. So we can expect that in the west, it's likely back in Ukrainian hands, even though the attack has been successful in the mid time. in between was the word. I apologize. So while they have been able to take the outermost houses, the Ukrainians likely took them back. At the same time, though, we have a Russian advance here in the south into that tree line. There's a fresh geolocalization that the Russians have now reached this tree line here, where there's also a fortification, some field fortifications in this area. I think we should probably see them when I turn this on. Not completely sure, but let's, yeah, here we have something. So they are in this tree line. The Ukrainians have probably lost control over those trees here over the last few days. The Russians are claiming that they also advanced from Verbove and that they managed to capture an important hill between Robotine and Verbove. I do not see any visual evidence of this. So as of now, this is not confirmed. If we go further to the west, we have Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, claiming that Krinky has been recaptured by the Russians. The fact is, though, that it doesn't seem to be true. We have Romanov, for instance, saying that the current zone under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces is marked in blue, which is this here. And this is where the footage has been taken, is right on the outskirts of that, where this picture is shown of the Russians claiming that they have recaptured Krinky. So we have Russian mill bloggers saying it's nonsense and the Ukrainians denying it as well. So it seems to be utter nonsense. Maybe the Russians took some positions. There's some fluctuation in the territorial control inside of Krinky in the last weeks, that positions that were considered to be in the hands of one side are then suddenly appearing in the side of the others, which doesn't necessarily mean they then are occupied. It might just be a gray zone, a contested area, but overall there is no proof that the Russians have actually recaptured Krinky. We also see a video in connection with that, even though it's not in a direct connection. This is from Krinky and is showing us a supply drop with a drone to a Ukrainian soldier in Krinky. When that was taken, I obviously don't know, and this doesn't prove that the Ukrainians are still in there. It's just an interesting video that I found in the context of that. While we are done with the developments along the front line, it's time to talk about the overall situation. Ukraine reported several more shot down planes. Basically, every day these days, they claim that they shot down some planes. Right now, as far as I see, only 2 Sukhoi 35 are confirmed to be shot down, while the rest, I think the other 5 are supposedly Sukhoi 34s, the fighter bombers. The Russians confirm that 2 Sukhoi 35s are down. What happened to the other ones? If the Ukrainian side confirmed, said the truth or not, I did not see a way to confirm it at that point, but at least the Ukrainians claim that they shot down 7. About the 2 Sukhoi 35, it's the typical Russian thing, which I still don't understand. Again, they claimed it was friendly fire. We see that as basically a permanent event on the Russian side, that they prefer claiming they do mistakes than admitting that the Ukrainians now and then do something competent. We had that with Moscow, that sank in a storm where there wasn't even a storm. We have had that in Belbek at the airfield, where a soldier was smoking, even though you could see craters from the hits of ballistic missiles on the airfield. Again and again, Russians prefer to say we are idiots to saying the Ukrainians are actually competent fighters now and then. So whatever the reason is here, this obviously is feeding the expectation that it was the Ukrainians shooting them down. But on the other hand, friendly fire happens. Even nowadays it can happen. So it's possible that the Russian air defense has actually shot down those 2 Su-35s. But in the past, at least, those claims were usually a way of shifting blame to yourself when you could blame the enemy. As said, I don't really understand why anyone would do that. If you have a clue, then maybe write it in the comment section. Maybe that helps a little. I don't know. So while we do know that 2 Sukhoi 35s are down, the Russians still were able to use a lot of gliding bombs in the Avdiivka area. According to the ISW, they were able to fly close air support for the first time with bombs, which means that for the first time in this war, they created a local air superiority in the area of Avdiivka. And this obviously means that they are the biggest threat, that Ukraine has been under big threat here and was under huge pressure at that point, as their field fortifications might be good enough to withstand mortar fire and artillery fire, but a hit of a 500 kilo bomb up to 1,500 kilogram bombs is a whole different level. And this was used by the Russians quite intensively during the final phase of Avdiivka. That was one of the main reasons the Russians were able to break through the Ukrainian lines fairly fast in the end. Ukrainians have shot and shelled a training ground, though, here at Trodivske. The Russians have confirmed that. There are videos that I can't show you that shows the corpses lying around. According to the Russians, there was three companies had a roll call to expect decorations. Major General Oleg Lvovich Moisev, the commander of the 29th Army, was supposed to hand over those decorations, which led to those soldiers having a roll call, and the Ukrainian side saw that and struck it with HIMARS. There is a video from a survivor of the Russian side, and you see on the horizon the corpses lying in a bad resolution. And he says that all of the other two companies are basically wiped out, and we were standing here waiting for them, and they just struck us, and these morons had us stand in line this close to the front line. And as you can see, it's actually fairly close to the front line and basically in range of conventional artillery. Obviously, it's fairly unlikely that the Ukraine will send an artillery piece, maybe a Panzerhaubitze or something like this close to the front line. But for HIMARS, it's in a very convenient range to strike it, and Ukraine did it at that point. Then Ukraine is saying Russia lost 47,000 men, 364 tanks, as well as 248 artillery systems and 748 armored fighting vehicles in the 4 months of fighting for Avdiivka. Those are the numbers the Ukrainians give us, so we should understand them as the maximum possible. It's highly unlikely that the real numbers are higher. It's fairly likely, it's very likely, or almost guaranteed that the actual numbers are lower, simply because of the fog of war. That doesn't mean the Ukrainians lie to us on purpose, even though that's a possibility. And on this channel now and then I showed you even how the Ukrainian General Staff, for instance, hid the truth from outside of its publications. Murz, on the other hand, who was a Russian mill blogger, said that the who fought with the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. So he was born in Ukraine. He said that Russia lost 16,000 in likely death and 300 tanks. The interesting context here is that he was forced to delete that, and after that he published on his Telegram channel that has over 100,000 followers. He published an accusation, a letter of complaint, and then said that he's going to commit suicide. And according to reports, he was later found dead. Obviously, it could theoretically be, and there are the according rumors that he might have been killed because of that publicated letter. In his letter, in his basically death message, he also said that he was threatened if he doesn't redact it, then his unit would no longer get any supplies, no shells, no ammo, no nothing, no tanks. So he was forced to do that. And publishing at the same time, publishing all of this and then publishing also a letter of complaint makes it, at least in my mind, not that likely that, and that letter of complaint was pretty steep, makes it not that likely that he was killed, but it's a possibility. Nevertheless, it's a mill blogger that occasionally I mentioned in the past episodes, so it was one that I was following too, and afterwards, after publishing these messages, he committed suicide. While we now have the numbers, so a top of 47,000 and Murz claiming 16,000, which we could consider a lower level. Obviously, Murz was a sergeant. So how exactly does a sergeant know the exact numbers? That's usually far above his pay grade. But if we take those numbers, we have some in this context, and then in this context we have an article from the New York Times. They say 2 soldiers with knowledge of Ukraine's retreat estimated that 850 to 1,000 soldiers appear to have been captured or are unaccounted for. The Western officials said that range seemed accurate. This is seemed, and they claim, and they don't mention the soldiers, so that's not a fact. But as we saw the rapid collapse of the Ukrainian defenses, it seems reasonable. I said it before. It must have been, I'm pretty sure it was in the last situation report that I said I heard from Ukrainian sources that they claimed they lost 20 fallen and 20 prisoners of war in this context, and that seems extremely low. That seemed unreasonably low. Those are numbers that seem to make much more sense, especially if we consider how the front line actually was here, that the Ukrainians only had this as a last retreat, while the Russians were already in the tree line here, and while they were here in the south, basically also already having a direct view into this, allowing it for permanent shelling with mortars and anything in this in this context. And at the same time, the position down here, the zenith position, was almost completely cut off and still held by the Ukrainians. That was the other thing. And here in this context, I reported that I heard from Ukrainian side about a supposed tunnel, but that seemed to have been pure propaganda or fantasy. I'm not completely sure from which point it originated, but it seemed to be like, hey, if the Russians have a tunnel to here, maybe we also have a tunnel to that, and that might have turned from a maybe we have a tunnel to we have a tunnel, because by now the Kiev Independent published another article about it, and it's horrifying. They were out of supplies, they were out of water, they couldn't help the wounded, and then they were forced to abandon them. Over a few days, the soldiers were retreating north, and one of them who survived said he could listen to his comrades getting wounded or killed on the way, one after the other. In the end, they had to leave the wounded back, and he fled, and they were heavily shelled, and the closest point was 120 meters between the two sides. That's what, 320 yards, 320 feet or something like this. So this was the closest distance between the two Russian positions between them, which they had to retreat. No talking about a tunnel, nothing like this. The losses alone from that position here, fleeing from that position, should have been already significantly higher than the 20. He said that 40% only made it out. Roughly, I think it says 30 to 40% of his unit made it out. So the losses there alone must have been bad. And there, from this position, I think it was where I told you in the last episode that there was a video call from a soldier who was left behind that was calling his mother, and his sister filmed it with the other phone. The soldier said that he can't move his legs anymore, so and that he was abandoned there. He called his family to basically say goodbye, and that means he was clearly hors de combat, meaning he was no longer able to fight, and thus he had to be protected according to the Geneva Convention. And by now his sister has identified as one of the corpses that was then later filmed by the Russians. 6 people were left behind there at that position, and 3 of them are already identified dead. 2 of them supposedly show bullet wounds. I was not able to see them. I was not able to clearly identify bullet wounds, but they were lying on the road, which would indicate that they have been dragged out from somewhere, either before that or after, and the blood on the pictures would indicate, on the video would indicate that they probably have died at that position. This seems to be another war crime committed by the Russians, executing wounded, and unfortunately it's not the only one that is to be reported. I think I've seen at least 3 videos over the past few days about executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war that are clearly raising their hand, and from close range they are being mown down by the Russians. Several of them from Avdiivka, but the same happened in Robotyne as well, where the Russians also executed some Ukrainian prisoners of war. We have a video from the Russians, from the Russian Ministry of Defense, showing us what is supposedly the retreat from Avdiivka. I had to cut this video because YouTube, for whatever reason, thinks it's showing violence if I show explosions. I had that in the past, and I don't want this video to get punished for it. So we can just see what happens before the explosions, and you see them walking here. And this clearly shows they were on foot. At least those groups were walking, and now look at the density of those units. Now imagine that the video, the original, shows shell hits. Every one of these shells might have killed 20 in this context. So the losses out of Avdiivka, I have no clue how high they were, but the fantasy that was spread that it was basically as intended and as planned and the losses were negligible is seems to be fairly unlikely if we look on the map, if we look at witnesses reports, like for instance here in Kiev Independent, if we take the New York Times series, which not every one of us does. And if we look at the videos from the Russian side here, where again, obviously, I have not seen a geolocalization. So in theory, it might be possible that this is from somewhere else, but it might already be geolocalized. I just haven't seen it. So in context, I think it was a disaster. I cannot say why. I cannot tell you why the Ukrainians didn't retreat earlier, especially the Zenith position in the south was obviously in danger. We talked about it in several situation reports when the Russians were advancing here close to the coke plant through this area. We talked over several episodes that the Ukrainian lines of communications are in danger of being cut off. Now, I'm not a military genius. This was obvious that they are in serious danger here. And the reaction on the Ukrainian side has been different than I would have expected. I cannot tell you why. I can just ask the questions why, and I have no idea. This is something that hopefully will be found out at some future point and hopefully will be answered what happened there, but that Ukraine got out after causing horrendous losses while they themselves suffered none is nonsense. Even though to the full context, we also need to say that Mutz, a pro-Russian, again, a pro-Russian mill blogger, admitted 16,000 fallen, but he also said that the Ukrainians got out fairly well. So the Ukrainians' losses have been lower. Now, lower than 16,000 is 7,000. That's still significantly lower, but we know that Ukraine will not be able to do a 7,000 to 16,000 exchange ratio all the time. They would have to do one that's at very least 1 to 5, probably better 1 to 7 to outlast Russia in this war. And it seems unlikely that they manage to keep that ratio in this battle, especially while lacking the necessary amount of artillery that is in dire need. We have in this context, though, a few pictures that show us what is happening behind the front line now. Now, I have no idea where this is, and the Ukrainians are not going to tell us. That's why you have it blurred, because that's obviously a military secret. But we see pictures here of fortifications being built, and it shows us a few details. This seems to be like a bunker, an earth bunker that they set up. We see that not only is it fortified, I think is the word, with wood on the sides to allow it a bigger strength, but the pictures here show wooden bars over the top, allowing for a top cover either for camouflage or to help against drones. Obviously, drone might be able to punch through, but if the drone pilot doesn't know exactly where the soldiers are and he strikes at that point here while the soldiers are here, they are probably fine. So this is an important thing and a change we've seen in the developments on fortifications. Already last summer, I showed it to you in one situation report where a Russian mill blogger visited a Russian fortification from the Zaporizhzhia region, already showing like basically top cover for the trenches. Here we see them using excavators, another sign that this is definitely not, or extremely unlikely, that this is somewhere here. An excavator would be a prime target. This is fully in range of FPV drones, fully in range of artillery. This is probably a fortification that would be built 20, 30, 50 kilometers behind the front line, where the danger isn't that big and where Ukraine so far seems to have been negligent when it comes to fortifying, and now they're actually doing it, realizing that they are on the defensive and thus are preparing it. We see them here, additional like heavy machinery. That's nothing you use right on the front line. But that's not all. We continue with with an information about from the region partisan sabotage and espionage. In Spain, Maxim Kusov has been found dead. He was the pilot of the Mi-8 who switched side. He flew his Mi-8 transport helicopter from Russia into Ukraine to change sides. I think he killed the two other crew members on board, if I understood it correctly in the context. At least they were dead, so he probably killed them. He then left Ukraine and settled down in Spain, and he was killed by being shot dead. That's obviously the response of the Russian intelligence, punishing him for being a traitor to Russia, and at the same time, this is clearly meant as a deterrence for other Russians who think about something like this. Like, you might get out, they might give you $500,000 in exchange, but we'll get you and we'll kill you in the end. So it's not worth it. Here in this regard, that's is probably the message that was meant to be sent. And in this regard, they managed to kill him. In troop generation, and this is still in context with Avdiivka, we have Medvedev saying that the Russians have recruited since January 1st 53,000 volunteers. 53 January 1st till February 15th. Now this is, we need to take these numbers with a grain of salt, but as I said in the past, if we take Western analysis or even GUR estimates, we see that the Russians' numbers are between 20 to 30% higher than they actually are, usually only 20%. So if we take 20 to 30%, this would mean that it wasn't 53,000, it was 40 to 45,000. And this would actually be exactly the 30,000 a month that the GUR said a month and a half ago. So, because in 6 weeks it would be 45,000, exactly the 30,000 that the Ukrainian military intelligence estimated. Now, why do I emphasize this? Ukraine is saying that Russia lost in 4 months of fighting of Avdiivka 47,000 men. In 6 weeks, they have already made up those personnel losses with fresh recruits, unless we understand the Ukrainian numbers as 47,000 being killed. But that would roughly mean twice as much in wounded, in seriously wounded. And I do not see the front line having lost 150,000 Russian soldiers just around Avdiivka. I mean, the fighting was happening at other positions too. That would mean in the last 4 months, what were they supposed to lose in that time? 200,000, 250,000. I think even the most pro-Ukrainian viewers would probably agree to me that to claim that Russia lost 250,000 in just 4 months seems vastly overblown. So if we look at what happened at Avdiivka, the losses were severe. I think by now over 300 tanks alone have been identified as being destroyed with visual evidence. The Russian losses have been massive. The individual soldiers that have lost their lives, we have no way of confirming it. We have seen fields filled with corpses. So extremely high losses are to be confirmed. But even if we take Ukraine's numbers, Russia was able to make up for this in 6 weeks. This shows us that Ukraine will not win a war of attrition if there's no significant change in the overall dynamics. Ukraine will be able to hold out for a couple of more months, but they will not be able to win this war just with this tactic alone, with this strategy alone. Then we have Putin signing a decree to nationalize, or at least put under national control, the Ulanovsk machine factory that was owned, that is or was owned by the Gildemeister Beteiligung GmbH, a German company that is in turn owned by a Japanese one. And as a machine factory, it seems to be clear that it's going to be used for military purpose for the defense industry in the near future. And at the same time, 6 different sources have confirmed Reuters that Iran has now roughly delivered 400 short-range ballistic missiles to Russia. The problem is that, according to those reports, those are from the family of the Fateh 110. Those short-range ballistic missiles include the Solfagar, and they have 700 kilometers in range and a CEP of just 10 meters. CEP is the circular error point, which means if it's 10 meters, then half of the missiles fired go within 10 meters of the target. Those are especially compared with the North Korean ones, those are extremely accurate missiles with a 700-kilometer range, where Ukraine barely has any air defense systems even capable of shooting them down, let alone enough. Ukraine only has SAMPT and some S-300V if they still have missiles, which nobody outside of military intelligence knows. And the Patriot systems, those are the only 3 systems that are even capable of shooting them down, and they have no way close an ability to protect all of Ukraine. So this will be a massive problem for Ukraine's air defense. In the political sphere, we have news from Russia. Russia has arrested a citizen that also holds US citizenship, because at least that's what I found, on day 1 of the of the invasion, she donated $51 to a human rights organization in Ukraine. Other claims are it's for the Ukrainian military, but I don't think it was, so I'm not completely sure. Nevertheless, she donated $51 on day one of the war. Now she's being arrested for treason and threatened with 20 years in prison. I guess she will be exchanged by the Russians at some point. At least that would be an option. We heard it from Tucker Carlson that Putin is trying to exchange the Wall Street Journal journalist with the murderer from the Berlin Tiergarten, where the German government refuses to exchange a journalist, even though he might have broken some Russian laws in regards to espionage, for a murderer. Then Russia is abolishing language tests if you want to move to Russia as somebody who identifies as a Russian. As a Russian will be identified who was a Russian citizen, who is a Russian citizen but lived outside of Russia, who has given up his Russian citizenship, or who was born in the Soviet Union, or who lived in the Soviet Union permanently and had its citizenship, or who was born in a territory and lived permanently that once was the Soviet Union or the Tsardom, so the Russian Empire. Interesting too that because this basically at the same time redefines the definition of what a Russian is. Now, in the context, in an apolitical context, this would be something for us to ignore. But in the current context, if everyone who was born in the Soviet Union, and that would include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, anything you can imagine that was once the Soviet Union, or the Russian Tsardom, so that would be half of Poland, basically. If you consider them Russians, then obviously the Russian government could claim that they need to protect them at the same time. So this doesn't necessarily mean Russia lays claim to these lands right now. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are about to invade them, but this is something in the context of Russia's past territorial claims that has to be kept in mind when we talk about it in the future. And there are news from the Emirates that banks are starting to cancel the accounts of Russian entities and Russian citizens. Again, apparently in response to the new American sanctions that threaten banks, which already led to banks in China and in Turkey to cut ties with Russians. In troop generations in Ukraine, we have an interesting news. The commander of the US Air Force in Europe said that Ukraine have now made a established a system to find Russian drones, and that works with microphones. Now, this is not new technology. In World War II, for instance, you had listening posts that looked ridiculous. I quickly looked up a few for you. Like, this is really, look at these pictures. Those, for instance, have been used in the past to identify planes. Now, what Ukraine obviously does is not using something like this. What they are doing is that they have a network where microphones are placed all over the country, which then send the data to a computer system, which identifies the drones according to the sound and then triangulates them, and thus allows for an identification where they are, how fast they're going, and in which direction they are going. The beauty about this is that it's completely passive, so there is no signature. For Russia to destroy them is close to impossible outside of an attack on with electromagnetic pulses. Would be close to impossible to destroy them. A sign of innovation from the Ukrainian side. And finally, in international support, we have a lot of news. Denmark said they're going to hand over all their artillery, but it seems to be all their artillery ammunition, not every tube that they have, simply because they said Ukraine needs it now and we can rebuild it. Rheinmetall has said that they're going to start a new ammunition factory in Ukraine that is likely going to be run with Ukroboronprom. The capacity to produce will be 6 digits. To which degree, obviously, we don't know. Whether it's 100,000 or 700,000 is a massive difference, but we don't know. The Netherlands said that the handover of 24 F-16s is in plan in regards to time-wise. So no delay from their part about the 24 F-16. And the US are now thinking about handing over long-range ATACMS as soon as the Congress has agreed to the aid package. This, again, Unfortunately, while this is good news for Ukraine, this is again a context where we need to ask a few questions. Why are Ukrainian defeats necessary for the US to send new weapons? Um, if this wasn't an escalatory step that would lead to nuclear war, why weren't they sent earlier? And we saw that in context of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, where the US has refused to hand them over cluster munition, of which, according to David X, for instance, 4.6 million shells are currently in storage and even no longer being used by the US Army. So Biden could send 4 million cluster munition shells for artillery to Ukraine because of his powers to hand over discarded weaponry up to 500 millions to other nations. He's not doing it in context, obviously, of the electoral campaign in the US, and he didn't give Ukraine ATACMS with cluster munitions at the beginning of the offensive, which allowed the Russians to take out Ukrainian tank columns with their Kamov 52, which then 3 or 4 months later were destroyed in strikes with said ATACMS. Now, a fresh Ukrainian defeat gives them new weapons, but it was another defeat that was needed that leads to the US now considering finally giving them longer range ATACMS. Also, the foreign minister of Ecuador said now they are not going to send weaponry to a war-fighting nation. This is being interpreted worldwide that Russia managed to blackmail Ecuador to not hand over the weaponry to the US to then give it to Ukraine. As we talked about twice, I think, in the last situation reports, at least in theory, it might also not mean anything. Because if Ecuador says that they are saying the truth, they are not giving Ukraine the weaponry, they are giving them to the US. What US does with them is their problem, basically. So while everyone interprets it as this means Ukraine is not gonna get them, this might actually not be the truth, but we'll have to see if Ukraine gets these weapons after all. Sweden has announced a 600 million aid package for Ukraine, ammunition, RBS 70 manpads, 80 GMs, as well as to acquire new CV-19 IFVs, CV-90 IFVs together with Denmark. And Canada will send 800 Skyranger R70 drones to Ukraine. I googled it because I'm pretty sure most of you won't know what a Skyranger R70 is either, and it seems to be an observation drone that is being built in Canada. Together, also, Ukraine signed a cooperation agreement with MDBA Germany for air defense, especially against drones. And Dynamit Nobel has also signed a cooperation agreement with the Ukrainians, supposedly about Panzerfaust 3, so basically the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that Germany delivered to Ukraine to co-produce them or maybe produce them in Germany for Ukraine. And we have finally some news that Bloomberg uncovered. Basically, the US didn't plan for the war to last. So for magical reasons, the war was supposed to end after 31 M1 Abrams were delivered and after the Bradleys were delivered. And as it didn't, the US didn't pre-plan. Now, this is not great news. But on the other hand, it's probably positive because that, according to Hanlon's razor, that would be incompetence by the Americans and not malice. So they didn't plan to not allow Ukraine to advance anything. They just somehow thought that it's going to solve itself after them sending a few. Again, another issue that we've seen, but I'm not just bashing the US today, as even though it might appear like this. Obviously, the US is the most important aid nation, but Germany is the second one, and Germany is now, they are now deciding that they're gonna send long-range weapons to Ukraine. And by now it became clear, yeah, it's missiles for the M270 and the HIMARS, basically GMLRS with the, 90-kilometer range. They're not going to send Taurus that Ukraine would direly need, and the Taurus that would be perfectly suited to take out the Crimean Bridge, where I said in the past this will be the litmus test for Germany's government if they want Ukraine to win. If they hand over Taurus and if they allow Ukraine to strike the Crimean Bridge with it, then we know that the German government wants Ukraine to regain its international borders to win this war. If Germany doesn't allow it, then they clearly show no interest, and we see Germany's government seems to still not being interested in enabling Ukraine to win this war. that was it from me for now, even though the video was again not really positive in most regards, at least to the pro-Ukrainian audience. I would still appreciate a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what you think about the developments. I think there's enough to discuss in this video. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. I am biased in this war. I said it in the past. I think Ukraine is the victim of an aggression here, and it should be helped to regain its international borders. It should be helped to win this war, but I see no point in lying to myself when I read about it, and I see no point in lying to my audience. So if you prefer, if you appreciate that somebody tries to be objective in what he talks about and not just reporting fictional victories because it's good for the audience, then I would really appreciate you subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell icon so you help me get closer to the 100,000, which would be the next goal. And if you want to support the channel, which is not possible without the support of all of you, then you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.